So welcome to this webinar. The webinar is called Abandoned Mines Management, and we are presenting a new tool to take inventory and assess risks. This webinar and this tool actually comes from a request from our members. So many of you might be those who requested, and it was a question that you had on, could you train us on how to start to manage abandoned mines? So during a couple of years, Rob Stevens here, who I will present in some minutes, developed this tool, and not only developed it, but also went in country for training and for implementing this tool, refined it, and this is what you will see today. Then we will be sharing later the presentation after all of this webinar in an email, and hopefully in some weeks you will have the tool available for your use. I wanted to present you to Rob Stevens, who's here. He's senior associate with the IGF. He's a geologist, PhD geology of University of Alberta, an accomplished trainer and policy advisor for the mining sector on mine closure, environmental management, socioeconomic frameworks, and land use planning. Many of you already know him from being in your country, so he travels a lot to your countries on mine closure, especially with us. So it's nice to have him now virtually here. And we also have here already Ahim Konstantin from BGR and the MinSus project in the Andean countries. He will be presenting what they've been doing in the last years, also related to abandoned mines. And in some minutes, we will also have Mirna Bonilla, the General Director of Hydrocarbons and Mines of El Salvador, who will also be presenting how El Salvador implemented this tool. So off to you, Rob Stevens. Good luck, and I will be here if you need me.
Great. Yeah, thanks very much, Marina, and welcome everybody. Good morning, good afternoon, wherever you are. I'm very glad that you've been able to join us with this webinar on abandoned mines. So just to get started, we're going to have a couple of poll questions just to get to know people a little bit better. So we've got two poll questions here that are in English, French, and Spanish. To be able to answer those, you may have to scroll down a little bit to get to question 2. But the first one is just asking what region you're from, so essentially what continent or regional area. And then the second question is to ask if you can give an estimate of the number of abandoned mines that may be in your country. All right, there we are. So of those that responded here, we've got about 15% from Africa. So great, welcome. 16% from Asia, 11% from Europe, 7% from North America, and 18% from Latin American and Caribbean. And then in terms of how many abandoned sites, so our largest number is less than 100. So that's good, not so many to manage. Another 16% between 100 and 500, 21% 500 to 5,000, and about 13% over 5,000. So obviously some jurisdictions have a large number of abandoned mines to consider and manage. So more of a challenge when you have a lot, but this tool can work for countries which just have a few sites or those that have a larger number, although you'll have to take it in little pieces if you have a large number of sites. All right, so great. Thanks for everybody participating in that. So I'm just going to go to the next slide here just for a quick then overview of what we're going to be talking about this morning or this afternoon, depending on where you are. First of all, I'm going to give a presentation, which is an overview of abandoned mines. So just so we can set the stage and framework. And this will have not only a bit of information about abandoned mines, but the risk assessment part of it. Then we'll have a presentation by Ahim Konstantin, who's the head project manager for MinSus BGR. And he'll talk about legacy site management in the Andean region. Then we'll be back to myself, and we're going to spend some time going through this abandoned mines inventory and risk assessment tool that we've developed. And I have a case study from Namibia. Our colleagues from Namibia were unable to join us this morning. Unfortunately, they're actually on a field study in Germany related to mine closure. So they're doing well there, but they weren't able to join us today. But I'm going to present a case study, and we'll go through the tool using this Namibian case study. Then we'll have another example from a different region, Myrna Bonilla Argomido, who's the General Director of Hydrocarbons and Mines in El Salvador. We'll talk a little bit about how they've been approaching the assessment of abandoned mines in El Salvador and some of the work that we've been doing with them. And then finally, right at the end, we're just going to have a short little bit. Jonathan Hamisi with the IGF is going to tell us a little bit about a project on remining tailings that we're working on. And he's got a survey for those that are interested to fill out and help us gather some data about that project. So I will now go right on to the presentation here. And what we're going to talk about in terms of this presentation are what are abandoned mines, just so we're all thinking about them in a similar way. What are the hazards at abandoned mines that we need to be concerned about? The impacts of abandoned mines. So often we call those the receptors, who or what is receiving an impact from an abandoned mine. And then a little bit about risk assessment, which is assessing the probability and consequence of hazards at the site impacting people or the surrounding environment. And then we'll have a little bit of a discussion about some of the challenges associated with risk assessment. So what is an abandoned mine? Just so we're all thinking about this similarly. Abandoned mine sites are those that are no longer operating and where there is no mine owner. And I think that's the key part of it, is that there's no mine owner. Generally because somebody has left the site without properly closing it down. And so abandoned mines have the potential to create a wide range of hazards, including safety issues for people and wildlife, environmental contamination, and risks to human health. And it's a global issue. As we saw just from the responses this morning, we have a number of participants here where there's more than 5,000 abandoned sites, or between 100 and 5,000. And here's some examples. Ontario, a region in Canada, is known to have more than 5,700 sites. The U.S. Bureau of Land Management, which is pretty focused on the western part of the U.S., over 52,000 sites, more than 6,000 in South Africa, and over 1,300 in Chile. So it seems like we're all similar in terms of the number of abandoned sites that we may have in our jurisdiction. So when it comes to assessing abandoned mines, and that's sort of the focus of the webinar today, so the presentation will focus on that as well. So assessing abandoned mines really requires an understanding of the potential hazards associated with with that site, and then the risks that those hazards present to people and the environment in order to then ultimately develop a remediation plan. So a key part of that is identifying the hazards. What are the potential hazards that exist at that site? Once we've identified that, we can look at the risks, which relate to the consequence of risk. And consequence really is focused on who can be impacted by those hazards. People, wildlife, the surrounding environment, businesses, those groups we often refer to as the receptors. That's where the consequence of those risks, of those hazards could occur. And then the probability is, what is that probability that the hazard might take place. So we have to look at identify those hazards, then looking at, well, who might be impacted by those hazards in terms of the consequence, and then estimating the probability. And then out of that, we can develop a remediation plan. So let's take a look at the hazards first. This is one of the first key parts that we're going to want to look at. And when we go through the tool, you'll see these same types of hazards will come up again. So contaminated water, that's an obvious one. It could be contaminated with a number of different chemicals, metals, even just sediment is contaminated water. And that might be coming from things like waste rock or tailings, underground openings, surface runoff, a number of potential sources for contaminated water. Dust and airborne particles is another one, which again can be metals, gases, sediment, and often coming off of any exposed rock or sediments at that site. Contaminated soil is another one, particularly in areas like around the process plant, maintenance areas, roads, labs, and any area that has not been revegetated or does not show any evidence of vegetation may well be one of those areas that's being contaminated. Even things like maintenance shops, part of the reason I mentioned that is oil and other fluids coming off of vehicles and that sort of thing could contaminate the soil in an area. Slope stability, that can be significant. Obviously, failure of those slopes, falling hazards off of steep slopes. We often see with artisanal and small scale miners, there's real risks with slopes or failures of underground workings. So open pits, workings, waste rock, dams, all issues or parts of mines that slope stability could be an issue. Then we have underground openings and underground workings. I should probably put even more than openings, where underground workings can cause some collapse from the surface. But obviously steep open holes are hazardous. We can get contaminated water coming out of those underground openings. Buildings is another one. They can be a source of contamination, potentially from process plants. They can be highly unstable. There can be sharp protrusions, steel and metal coming out. So those might be left over from the mill, labs, maintenance shops, those sort of things. And then safety. A wide range of different potential safety issues, both from a physical and a chemical point of view, that could relate to, almost any part of a mine site. So this is a kind of a, water, dust and airborne, soils, slope stability, underground openings, buildings and safety are all hazards that we need to look at and assess when trying to understand the potential impacts of an abandoned mine. We can also look at the hazards associated with different types of mines because they're not all going to have the same potential hazards. So medium to large scale coal mines, really those ones do have the potential for the full range of hazards. Of course, every site will be a bit different, but there's potential for that full range of hazards to occur. For ASM or artisanal and small scale mining, we have a different set. There may be numerous small scale unstable openings, and I think you can see that in this photo here where any active shafts here would have a small winch above it with people going down, but those openings are quite unstable. So there's safety issues, use of mercury that can then result in soil contamination, water contamination as well. Quarries tend to have a smaller or a lesser range of potential issues. But of course, if you have a pit, you do have physical and safety issues associated with that, dust, and possible chemical contamination depending on the nature of the mine. And then with exploration sites, those tend to be the smallest, and in some jurisdictions, the largest number of abandoned sites relate to exploration. And we may find that there's small, relatively small trenches, former campsites, roads. There can be abandoned fuel storage drums and waste and buildings, potentially camp buildings, that sort of thing. So anyway, good to sort of think about the nature of the mine when assessing it and the potential hazards that could occur at that type of mine site. So once we understand the hazards at a site, a second key part of evaluating an abandoned mine are relate to the risks, but we talk about the receptors. So who or what might be impacted by those hazards at the site? And that goes directly to assessing the consequence of those hazards when we're doing our risk assessment. I've got 4 categories here, and these are the common categories that are focused on in doing a risk assessment. So the first is people. And what kind of risks might people be impacted by? Certainly water contamination, airborne contamination, food contamination, for example, crops growing in soil that is contaminated. And of course, safety hazards through falls, through underground workings, and potentially impact to cultural sites. Livestock and wildlife, they might be using that water at that site or forage for plants growing on an abandoned site. If there's endangered species in an area, that may be even a higher concern if they could be potentially killed from some aspects of an abandoned site. Then we look at the surrounding environment, so the broader area around a mine site. Waterways are often one of the biggest issues because water at a mine site, of course, can move off of that mine site, get into larger water systems that may be widely used by people or wildlife. But there could be impacts on protected areas, again, endangered species. And then the fourth sort of receptor in terms of impacts from abandoned sites are properties and business. So is there potential for damage to buildings, to crops and infrastructure, loss of income, loss of tourism, those sort of aspects. So when, again, we're going to do a risk assessment of an abandoned site, we want to understand how people, livestock and wildlife are using the site, what potential impacts there are to the surrounding environment, and what businesses or properties could be impacted in order to understand that consequence to those hazards identified at the site. Now, one thing I like to mention is that we don't always need to be always think of all the negative parts of abandoned sites. More often, that's what we do think. But sites that have been abandoned, particularly for a long time, do start to become, in a way, part of the natural environment of that area. And there may have been development of habitat for wildlife, for example, that needs to be considered if one's going to try to remediate that site. So a good example we often hear is with bats, particularly with underground openings, those become places where they rest during the evening or during the day, or maybe seasonally. And the photo here you can see on the right is an example where an underground opening has been sealed off from a safety point of view, so people aren't getting in and out. But that grate allows bats to move in and out of that site. Also can be lakes. Old quarries and open pits will develop into lakes that with time may have their own habitat, aquatic habitat and plants and species. You can get unique micro ecosystems. Close to where I live, there's some really steep waste rock piles that were placed, decades ago. And what they found was there's a small little mouse called a pika that was found in these waste rock piles. And it was the most southern known existence of these animals in British Columbia anyway. And so it was sort of, okay, well, we've actually developed a bit of a unique ecosystem here that animals that don't normally live in that area are taking advantage of. So we might want to think about that before implementing our restoration efforts. Of course, historic sites, archaeological benefits to some abandoned sites. There could be some tourism. People love to go underground, particularly if you can ensure the safety of that. That's an opportunity. Rock hounding and climbing. Use of education and training center, underground cooling and storage. And potentially, repurposing. Maybe the land could be used for other purposes, or it could be remined. And that's something we're going to talk about right at the end. It's about the potential for remining tailings. So it is worth thinking of the opportunities as well as while assessing mines and coming up with plans on how to address them. So community involvement, always important to keep communities engaged and involved in abandoned mines, particularly that those who live in and around those sites. They may have an interest in them that is important to understand. And one of the challenges I know that I've come across in working in different countries is having data on abandoned sites, even knowing where those sites are, what are the potential hazards there, how are people or wildlife using that site. Local communities can be very helpful in terms of providing that information and helping support an understanding of the issues at that site. So I think, just generally involving communities and also having them potentially participate in some of the restoration or remediation activities that will take place at that site is also a good opportunity to build some understanding of what the issues are and to have, in a way, a bit of an ownership in restoring those sites. So hopefully that restoration activity will hold and be successful in the end. So then when we get to risk assessments, we're going to look at this with the tool in just a little bit. So risk assessment, really, it's about identifying hazards that pose unacceptable risks. And it's really about identifying a problem, not a solution. So today, what we're going to look at is identifying the risks at a site, which doesn't then develop a closure solution or a remediation solution. But the first step is to understand the risks that exist and the nature of those risks. And from there, then you can generate that solution. So risk assessment is sort of qualitative or semi-quantitative. We do come out with numbers on it, but it's very much a sort of a qualitative assessment, and the experience of the risk assessor is quite important in that. People often say it can provide a coarse grain filter to identify sites that require follow-up and more detailed assessment. And I would say that's very much the tool that we've developed, is aimed to help arrive at an initial inventory and risk assessment of a site that will generally require, let me backtrack. You do that with a lot of sites, and then you can prioritize those high-risk sites from, say, lower-risk sites. And then you can follow up on those high-risk sites by doing a more detailed assessment and then developing a remediation plan. So often risk assessment can be a bit of an iterative process, doing an initial assessment of a wide range of sites, understanding the high-risk ones, then doing more detailed work on those high-risk sites before developing a plan to address them. Okay, maybe I'll just keep going here. So generally when we have a risk assessment, we do that on a matrix. And the matrix has two parts to it, probability and consequence. So as I mentioned, first, we would understand the hazards at the site. So there are water contamination hazards, safety hazards, underground working hazards. So understand those hazards at the site, then understand the receptors. So who might be impacted by those hazards? That was people, wildlife, the surrounding environment, and businesses. Then for each hazard, we assess what is the probability or the likelihood that that hazard will actually occur. And then to which receptors. So for example, water contamination. When we would go to a site, we would assess and look at it to understand whether there is a probability of water contamination. We may need to collect samples and do analysis and that sort of thing. And then we would assign a probability that there is contaminated water at the site. Then the second part is, okay, well, what is the consequence if there is contaminated water at that site? So that is then to people, wildlife, the surrounding environment, and businesses. So it really has those parts. What are the hazards? Who could be impacted by the hazards? Then we identify a probability of that hazard occurring and what is the consequence if it does occur. So the steps, and this is what we're going to look at in the tool. As I said, identify the hazards, identify the receptors, people, animals, environment, property. What is the likelihood or the probability of the hazard occurring? What is the consequence if that hazard actually occurs? Then we categorize that on a risk assessment matrix, and then we prioritize and follow up with the next steps. So this is actually a screenshot taken right from our risk assessment tool. This is a typical kind of matrix that you would use for risk assessment. On the left side, we have the probability and likelihood that goes from very unlikely. So whatever hazard we're talking about, the probability of it occurring goes from very unlikely all the way to almost certain at the top. And then for that particular hazard, we would look at the consequence, for example, a consequence to people, which could range from negligible, so really no consequence, all the way through to significant. And so by identifying those two parts for each hazard, the probability and the consequence, we can place it on this matrix to sort of visually understand the range of risks at the site. So it does require us to have some guides about how do we determine, whether it's likely or unlikely or probability. And so there is a fair bit of guidance out there, and the tool itself has some guidance in it that helps you to make those decisions. This one comes from the ICMM's Integrated Mine Closure Guideline from 2019, although I will notice that they have just released an updated version of this in 2025 of their mine closure guideline. But you can see, let's just take a look. If we're trying to understand this is likelihood or probability, so what does likely mean? So they're putting likely means a 30 to 90% chance that it's going to occur. So likelihood of occurring is equal or more than 30% and less than 90%. The consequence is not uncommon in the mining and metals industry or area. Then if we went to almost certain, we would say it's greater than 90% likelihood of occurring, has happened, will probably happen during the mine life, and there's no reason to suspect it won't happen. So these phrases are there to help you place a hazard or understand the probability of that hazard so that you can assess it on the matrix. And then, and there's many different versions of this that help with, with different wording and different guidance to help with the risk assessment. And then here's one for consequence. This was also taken from ICMM. And in this case, they're looking at consequence of a number of different factors. So the consequence of the schedule, financial, important for industry, safety, environment, that sort of thing. So let's just take safety. Insignificant in that case means it's a first aid case. If we get to moderate, there's a lost time injury. If we get to high, there's a permanent disability or single fatality. And if we get to major, numerous permanent disabilities or multiple fatalities. So again, you can see how it kind of ramps up and gives you some guidance on how to answer or how to place the consequence on the matrix. So here's an example. There's quite a bit going on in this matrix. This is actually one from the work that the group in Namibia is doing. And essentially, they have identified two broad categories of hazards, chemical hazards and safety hazards. They've looked at the various features on the mine site, such as open pits, plants, process plants, waste rock, and have identified all of those various hazards on the site and done a probability and consequence assessment of them all. And here's what they've arrived at. So obviously one up here in the top right, which has a severity of consequence of high and also a probability of high, those are the features at that site that are of highest concern and would be the ones that really need to be addressed. depending on where you land on the matrix also allows you to compare multiple sites. So often by taking the highest risk elements and that is used to then categorize multiple different sites. So for example, if we went to another site and they were all in the green area, that would have a lower priority to address than sites that have risks in the high risk area. And in this case, these were both safety risks, one associated with the open pit, so there was probably steep walls and that were unfenced, so a safety issue there. And then the second one was a safety issue associated with the process plant. So it could be buildings, it could collapse, or other openings that are risky. All right, so some of the challenges in risk assessment, it's really kind of a quantitative process where different assessors will come out with different answers based on their own perception of risk and their own risk tolerance. I've done these exercises with several people at the same time, and not everybody comes up with the same answer. So I think there's value in doing it with a group. And obviously, the more experience you get, the better you will get at that. But there's not a single right answer when you're doing risk assessment. It's considering a variety of factors. We're often dealing with incomplete or unknown data that can make the risk assessment difficult. Of course, the more information you have, the better your risk assessment is going to be. You have questions like how much contamination is too much, or when is the safety risk too high? Those are questions that are not always black and white and can create challenges in a risk assessment. Can be obviously lack of resources for doing a risk assessment to start with, and certainly to develop and implement a remediation plan. Community concerns and changes around a community can be a concern. And also we have to consider climate change, because our sort of status quo or typical ways of approaching abandoned sites may not be effective as we go forward with issues related to climate change. And just to wrap up the presentation here on abandoned mines, I wanted just to mention about funding, because this is often one of the biggest issues is, how are we going to get the funds to actually address these abandoned mines in our site? And it's always a challenge. So number one is government, but governments generally do not have a lot of money. They may be able to provide a little bit to address small amounts of issues at a time. But realistically, that is the primary source that we see is government providing funds for that. Another one are pooled funds, and the Australians, I think, are really leading on this. So Western Australia, the Northern Territory, Queensland are all developing pooled funds, which current mine operators contribute into a fund that then can be used to address the rehabilitation of abandoned mine sites. So essentially, it's a means of current mine operators contributing to a fund to address those what we often call legacy issues of older sites. There's another version of that in Ontario, and for some coal mines in the US, there's a production levy. So instead of companies contributing to a pooled fund, in the case of Australia, there is a levy now on the production that comes from mines. In Ontario, it's for aggregate producers. In the US, for the surface coal mines. And that generates a fund that can be used. We can see in the US, though, as of 2022, they had about 12 billion collected. And I think a lot of that's still sitting there. So maybe the challenge here is not so much having the funds, but having a plan of how to implement those funds, which is also sometimes a bit of a challenge. Government industry agreements and partnerships are an interesting one. I saw one in Northern Canada where there was an area of historic mining that had a number of issues to it. And essentially, but there was a lot of potential mineral resources left. And so there was a sort of deal for a company to come in. They would get all the mineral resources and the potential for future mining, but at the same time, they had to address those existing environmental issues. So that's a kind of a win-win type agreement. And communities. I mean, communities are a great source of inspiration and energy and, people power to come and help clean things up. They often need a little bit of a help, but they can be quite cost effective because people want to see, the environment around where they live improving. So that's an interesting one to consider as well. And Sudbury, Ontario, an area that had significant environmental impacts as a result of smelters in the past. It was really communities that drove the restoration or rehabilitation of that area. All right, and I think there we are. That is my overview then of abandoned mine sites just to get us started here. And we will have a little bit of time as we go through, especially later in the webinar, for some questions. But to keep things rolling here, I want to move right on now and introduce Akim Konstantin, who's the head project manager for MinSus BGR, so an Andean countries cooperation. And he's going to be talking about legacy site management in the Andean region. And maybe, Akim, just before I go over to you, I did want to acknowledge that all this work that we are doing, that the IGF is doing on abandoned mines and sites, has been funded through BGR and German cooperation. So we really want to acknowledge BGR, which is the German Geological Survey, and foreign development funding. So that is very much appreciated, and it's really helped us to develop this tool and pilot it, and now to be able to present it out to our members. All right, so maybe I'll turn it over to you, Akim, and you're going to share your screen. Is that going to work for you?
Okay, sure. Perfect. So thank you, Rob, for the perfect introduction. So I will switch now to Spanish because I want to present our experiences from South America. Entonces, mi nombre es Achim Konstantin. Trabajo, como ya se ha dicho, para el Servicio Geológico.
As it has been said, I work for the German Geological Institute. This is a project that we are implementing with ICLAC. We cover several topics. One of them is the remediation of abandoned mines. And I want to share with you a brief introduction to it. 3 million tons of copper. This is the volume that the research site IRENA estimates that by 2050 will be needed to satisfy the demand of renewable energies like solar energy and wind energy. These forecasts are quite challenging. There might have errors, but imagine that the increasing demand of lithium and rare earths is inevitable. In this context, we should highlight that all existing studies show that this demand won't be met by greater technological efficiency and recycling. So if we want a digital world and a greener world, we need more mining. This is important to highlight in this context. The Andean region plays a key role in this regard because it's been a key producer of essential minerals for digitalization. For example, Chile produces copper, lithium, and the region has geological reserves, 50% of lithium and a third of copper worldwide. It's important to point out that some Andean countries like Peru and Chile, they already have a mining history of industrial scale, but they already face challenges in this regard because many past mining activities were not made with an environmentally adequate approach, with the adequate remediation and care for the environment. So in these countries, you may check the numbers on the slide, It's the dark side of mining. You have abandoned mines, this mining environmental liabilities that have been left there that have an impact on the industry today. On the left, you can see the city of Huancavelica in the 16th century. It's an emblematic case. The Santa Barbara mine, it's famous for its exploits. It was the mercury source for the Spanish crown. They needed the mercury to extract gold in Potosí. After 400 years, it is one of the poorest departments of Peru. It suffers public health issues due to environmental contamination from the mine. This is a very common problem we see in many regions, in many areas of the Andean region, with its mining history. The local communities, therefore, resist new mining projects, especially if environmental issues of the past are not dealt with. There's an interesting survey that showed that today, the main challenge for mining companies is to obtain the social license to operate. So considering the increasing need for mining in the future, then it is essential to deal with the past mining liabilities caused by irresponsible mining.
¿Por qué nos preocupan los pasivos? Creo que Rob dio una perfecta introducción, ¿no? No hay una definición única general.
Why are we worried about liabilities? It is a concept that is completely applicable in the Andean region. And this is considering the current legislation. We see different abandoned mining components that pose a risk for the environment, human health, or the property. In this slide, you can see some pictures of liabilities in Peru. On the left, we can see abandoned tailings. Some of them have heavy metals and they pose significant risks for the environment and health for the surrounding populations, etc. On the bottom left, we can see Ticapampa. It is located together close to a human settlement. And even though you cannot see it in the picture, that river carries part of the tailings downstream, and that contributes to the contamination of the basin. And here we can also see the contamination of the mine, either leaving the mine, or you can see in the middle picture another example. This can bring heavy metals to superficial or underground water. I don't want to spend too much time here because the introduction by Rob was very good and the overview was very precise on how you do the assessment and the risk assessment. I think it is a structured way to do it with a gradual scheme. Many times it will include different stages. We have the main stage, which is identification, including locating the passives, the liabilities, establishing some of the associated risks. And then finally, for those sites that require intervention, providing the proper intervention. The scheme that I showed in my slide, it is something that CEPAL has recently published. I also wanted to say something that Rob highlighted.
Each stage poses its own challenges. For instance, identifying liabilities, but that also includes being able to identify who's responsible. Many times the companies that are responsible for it do not exist anymore. Sometimes they would have operated within a strict legal framework, but they don't exist anymore. Some of them won't have the financial stance to be able to afford these changes. So at the end of the day, the question is who will take on the responsibility of carrying out these plans, these remediation plans. Then I want to show you some examples of some remediation plans that were subsidized by the state and some of them that were voluntary. However, given the size of the problem, it's important to highlight that we're still looking for more innovative approaches for these challenges. As we saw in the introduction, some of the sites will most likely require some investigation. Now, if we look into the Andean region, there's only one country, which is Peru, has a liability remediation program. They have established an inventory that includes about a big number of sites. We did a risk inventory, and in those sites that are prioritized, they establish a state company, which is Activos Mineros. They are in charge of carrying out the necessary studies, making the calls for proposals, and identifying who can do this best. Up to date, they have managed a significant portfolio of projects with 65 efforts. This represented about 1,200 liabilities, and that represented $250 billion that were invested. The figure may seem small as compared to others, but we have some interesting projects. We have for uranium remediation with Miss Muti. It has cost so far $8 billion. However, I think that results in Peru have been significant, and many of the areas that were affected were remediated successfully, and we could remediate as well the environmental impacts of this. On the left, you can see the Excelsior Desmontera. It was done in the year 2016. You can see on the left before, and on the right when it has been already remediated. So that shows you the positive impact. Of course, it is not challenge-free, but this is something very important and very significant for Peru. So the next case I want to mention is the following. Voluntary remediation, we call it that way. I want to show you a case in Andacollo in Chile. This is also emblematic because of the liability management. There are about 11,000 inhabitants there, and there are about 90 historical tailings deposits. Many of them are abandoned. These deposits are the result of underground copper and gold exploitation. It was in the 90s. The mills were established in urban areas, which led to the tailings to be close to the populations, to human settlements. This, of course, poses many risks. For instance, mercury contamination, but also contaminated dust, given the nature of the tailings, and of course, all the impact that this has on human health. About 10 years ago, the mining company Teck located the tailing deposits. It contained about 250,000 tons of material. They transported it to an active plant of the same company. And more recently, a similar project has been carried out with a Whittle mining company. It was also located in the Coyo. This is an interesting project. It was financed by a private mining company as part of their own social responsibility. A very crucial challenge in liability remediation, but also in the management, is tailings. And this is so because mining generates a big volume of tailings, and this can pose many geotechnical and also contamination risks. I think many people are not aware of the amount of residue coming from mining. I think I have a very representative example, is that a copper company will have 0.3, 0.5% of copper. That means 99.5 to 99.7% of what is extracted in a copper mine is residue. So the question is, what do we do with those tailings? The current focus, the general current focus, it is to store them indefinitely in warehouses that require maintenance, and it seems unsustainable in the long term. The most current focuses have been distinguishing these three main aspects. The first, the readaptation of those tailings, which are crucial for mining in operation because it reduces physical risks, but then also the reuse, recycling, and treatment of tailings. For instance, storing them underground as a underground filling of unused sites, and that has been gaining traction lately. And then, of course, we have the proactive, comprehensive tailing management, and this is crucial as well for environmental management. At the beginning of my presentation, I mentioned that it's important to explore more innovative approaches. And precisely, I want to show you an interesting case in Puno, in Peru. It is a project led by the Los Rosales company. It is a small and medium-sized site. It was an old copper production place, but these tailings still have gold and silver. And the business model of the company is processing tailings, and that allows to finance the closing of the other liabilities of the copper mine, like mine openings. And then also it allows them to process those tailings within the environmental standards. We were able to contribute with the project with mineral and metal residues to increase the benefits. In this case, I think it represents a self-sustainable tailing management. It is self-sustained economically speaking, and it also allows for companies to get involved in these kind of processings. Apart from valuable elements like gold and silver and other metals that are usually found in small traces in mine sites, most of the of the elements are inert materials, and they can be used in many different industries. For instance, in the cement industry, they can be used as a loan material in construction, for filling infrastructures, or for bigger projects, for instance, for the use of geopolymers, etc. In this graphic, you can see the chemical results of 642 tailings that were analyzed in Chile. This was provided by the geological service called Cernagiomin. And what do we see in these results? Well, most of the tailings are mainly made up of silicates, and that makes them very interesting to consider for the industry, for construction, and for many other applications as well. Without going into much detail, I can say the following. Of course, it's not very easy because many times they will have heavy metals and high concentrations of iron, for instance, which would complicate the application in other industries. But we also have to do some granulometries and analyzing the physical characteristics of the tailings. However, the results are promising, and it shows many potentials that these mining tailings have, especially in Chile. And they have analyzed 10 million cubic meters of tailings, and it is important to continue to study a combination of innovative solutions so that we can find better approaches in the long term for these tailings. Rob also mentioned this. Apart from the abandoned mining residues, we have to see the alternative for the use of abandoned mine sites. For instance, underground pipes. Sometimes they can be used as bunkers or for disposing of dangerous residues or for labs. But then there are also more innovative approaches, and I want to give you this example at the end. This is a study carried out by the Clausthal University in Germany. They can use it as storage by pumping. This is already used on the surface, and now what you do is you pump water when there is excess energy, and then when you need energy again, you use the water out to generate energy. So we could use this to generate, to store electricity and then generate electricity when it is needed. I haven't heard of similar projects in the Andean region that already has a big potential for this. Mining has left big holes, of course, considerable difference in height between them. An example is the contrast between the mountain and the coastline, that these could be used for storage by pumping. The Medtronic platform is, I used the Medtronic AI, and I asked it to generate an image of how we would do it with the copper mine in Chile. And this is the result. Of course, you can improve this, but this is done with a futuristic point of view. So thank you very much.
All right, great. Yeah, thank you very much, Hakim. It was great to see a number of examples that sort of built on some of the comments I made in that presentation. And I think one thing that I would maybe take away from some of those examples, I think having the dollars to really implement a successful abandoned mines program is always the challenge. Where is the money coming from? And I think in the examples that you presented, there were different approaches to that. But in most cases, I guess, there was an economic parameter to that. So let's say where Teck was coming in, they're operating, they're generating revenue from their operating mines, which they then turn back into addressing some of these older issues. In the case of potentially power generation, that sort of thing, there's an economic element to it. Reprocessing the tailings, so that was a great example there that we'll talk about again right at the end, is another opportunity to generate some revenue and then turn that back into addressing those legacy issues. So I always think that's a really good way of trying to approach it, is where is there an opportunity for some economic activity? Because, unfortunately, if we try to go to government, yes, there are some funds, but it's never as much as we would like. So I think those examples were really good examples of different approaches to how to fund the abandoned mines issues. So,
thank you for the comment.
Great. Yeah, well, thanks very much. Hopefully you can stick around to the end in case there's some questions. We have a bit of time at the end for the questions, but I do want to keep moving on here now, and I'm going to share my screen, but also maybe David, you can bring up poll number 2. So we have a couple of poll questions for everybody to answer this time. The first one is asking whether you have an active abandoned mines program or team addressing issues in your country. And then the second question is, what are the biggest hazards associated with abandoned mines in your country? Here we go, sharing the results. So we had 46 people. Thank you for answering that. So yeah, almost half and half here with yes, there is an abandoned mines program that the government is working on, and the other half saying no, and a few unsure. That's actually more than I thought. I know that often when I'm working with different governments, what we find is that there's a real concern around abandoned mines, but they don't sort of have an initiative or a program in place. So it's nice to see such a large number there. And then when we come to what are some of the most significant hazards, yeah, very evenly spread here. So chemical contamination, safety issues for people, impacts to land, all getting similar ratings. A little bit less on underground workings. That may be because there are fewer underground mines. And then physical instabilities come up as well. So yeah, great. Okay, well, thanks everybody for that. As I said, great to see so many countries are working on addressing abandoned mines. All right, so I'm going to stop stop sharing that now. I think it's gone. Maybe you guys can confirm with me, but okay, so what we're going to move on to now is we're going to take a look at our abandoned mines inventory and risk assessment tool. So again, a couple of things. This presentation we will send out as a PDF to everybody afterwards, along with a survey for the webinar. The tool, which I'm going to demonstrate in a moment, is not yet available on our website. We're just doing some final adjustments and completion of it. So we expect that will get loaded up in the coming weeks/months. I'm going to say less than months, but so there'll be an announcement that goes out once that's ready. But you will get this presentation. So. All right, so if we want to just, I've taken a screenshot of the tool and I'm going to load up the Excel sheet in a moment or two here, but I wanted to just pop up a screenshot of what the tool looks like. So when you open up the spreadsheet, this is your kind of welcome page that brings you into the tool. And again, just wanting to acknowledge German Cooperation and BGR for their support in working with the IGF to develop this tool. And essentially what you see on the bottom in these different colored tabs, so it's a spreadsheet-based tool that has different tabs where the user then inputs information about an abandoned site, adding for a site information, what are the mine components, what are the receptors, so those people, wildlife, businesses, etc., that could be impacted by hazards, identifying hazards at the site, and then doing that risk ranking. So you sort of sequentially go along each of those tabs, filling in information and doing that risk assessment. So what is the aim of the tool?
Entonces, ¿cuál es el objetivo de la herramienta?
What we identified was that there were a number of jurisdictions that were concerned about abandoned mines and did not have an assessment or an inventory. We looked around, and there are a few tools out there, but a number of them are quite complex and would take a significant amount of effort to learn to use and to implement. So we wanted to develop something that was relatively quick and easy to create an inventory and a risk assessment of abandoned mine sites. So this was particularly where there was no inventory or risk assessment that has been done. The tool is to be used one site at a time. So every site you would have a separate spreadsheet filled out for each site. You require data, of course, from the site, and the more the better. Now, the tool is set up that if you have relatively limited information, you can still use the tool, but there has to be caution in terms of the quality of the risk assessment that you will complete. If you have somewhat limited data, the risk assessment is going to have a lot more uncertainty to it. So the more data, the better. If you do multiple sites, so as I said, the tool is designed for one site at a time, but if you do multiple sites, then you can prioritize all those sites based on the risk assessment that you've done. So while you're using the tool site by site, you can combine those together to give you a prioritized list of sites which identify the high-risk sites that will require, the most attention. It does not require a field assessment, a field visit, but really assessment should be verified with a field visit. So you can use the tool and do a risk assessment without having visited the site, but I really think that verifying that risk assessment does require a site visit to fully assess the issues at that site. And then remediation plans can be developed based on the tool, the risks that were identified, and the prioritization of different sites. The tool itself does not generate a remediation plan. It identifies those risks, but it doesn't develop the plan. That would be the next step after using the tool. So I'm going to demonstrate the tool using an example from a site in Namibia. And I want to acknowledge my colleagues in Namibia for providing this information. I mentioned at the beginning, unfortunately, they're on a field excursion right now in Germany, learning about post-mining transition and closure. But I want to thank them for providing this information and allowing me to use this site as our case study today. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm just going to talk a little bit about this Usakos tourmaline mine, because this is the site that we're going to sort of step through the tool and do a risk assessment of. So let's learn a little bit about this site. So as I said, thank you to the Namibian Ministry of Energy and Mines and the Geological Survey for allowing me to use this site. In Namibia, they have a team that works on their abandoned mines that is actually generally using a more complex inventory risk assessment tool that was also developed with support by BGR a number of years ago. And so it was a great jurisdiction to do a test case of our tool since they're very experienced in doing these risk assessments. And they certainly found our tool was quite useful to help with a risk assessment. So here's the location of the Usakos tourmaline mine, so people have a sense of where that is located. Zooming in a little bit, the red circle is the actual site itself. And this is just a screenshot from Google Earth. So it's a mine that operated during German colonial time and possibly as late as the 1940s. This can be a bit of a challenge with abandoned sites, is knowing exactly when they were abandoned. But this site is located very close to the town of Usakos with a population of approximately 4,500 people. So we're only a few kilometers away from that site. And the site is adjacent to the Can River, which you can see running along the top part of the photo and then almost north-south down the left side of the photo. So this site is quite close to people and quite close to a river system. I should also mention just above the abandoned site is a railway as well as a highway. So zeroing in a little bit more on the site, we can see the railway there at the top left of the photograph. So there's an abandoned pit, an open pit. There's a refinery and concentrator with various components of that left, some buildings remaining. There's some waste rock and tailings that are left on the surface, and more buildings that were part of a crusher. We can also see a residence here that is really located just immediately adjacent to that abandoned site. So taking a look a little more specifically, here is the open pit. Fortunately, I was able to go there on a field trip in October. So the photograph on the left is just taken from October. Obviously, you can see some steep walls there. And on the right side, there has not been any revegetation. And given this site's been abandoned a long time, it has not naturally revegetated, which could be due to a lack of soil, but it could also be concerns with chemical contamination. This was one of the more interesting features at the site, parts of the old concentrator and process plant, these cylindrical features. On the right here, you can see that there's several of those features, and then a couple of photos here focusing down on them. So very significant safety hazard. It does appear as if somebody was occupying at least one of those cylindrical structures for a period of time. And then in the background, in the top left photo in the background, you can see some of the buildings that are still remaining. So here we are, buildings relatively unstable. There were metal and other sort of hazardous objects sitting, remaining in those buildings. So people got access to them. There were safety hazards associated with that. On the top left is some of the fine-grained tailings with a bit of a dam in front of it. And likewise down in the bottom right, so some material there, not fully vegetated, as you can see, even though it's been abandoned for quite some time. All right, so just coming back to the photograph of the overall site. And so that leads me now, I am going to go and share the tool itself. So I'm going to share the Excel tool. So just give me one moment here to launch that. All right, so now we're in Excel, and hopefully people will be able to see this reasonably well. There's a number of tabs here, so I'm going to try to enlarge it so it's visible. I know if any of you are on your phone, it's probably going to be a little bit challenging to see. But again, the way that this tool works is really you want to look at the bottom of your screen where you can see these color-coded tabs here. Essentially, you would walk through each of those tabs as you're doing the inventory and risk assessment for a given site. So this one is specifically for the Usukos site. So our first tab is just a welcome, some acknowledgements, and if you have any corrections or suggestions, we're always happy to get that, and you can send that to us. So I'm just going to step through each of these tabs one at a time. The next one now is the site summary. So this one actually presents the overall summary of the site. Much of the information here is actually automatically populated as you work your way through other parts of this tool. This tab, the site summary, is actually what would be extracted and then put in a broader inventory. So for example, if you were going to be assessing 15 sites in your region, then once you've completed this site, which is the Usukos mine, you would extract this particular tab into a second spreadsheet, which then becomes the inventory of all of the sites. So this is really just our high-level summary. And it does have in it, right at the very end, the completed inventory, the risk assessment matrix, basically. So that is automatically transferred over as you work your way through the tool. Now, the first actual tab that you really start adding information is the one on site information. So we've included a number of different, sorry, just give me 1 second here. There we go. There's a number of different headings. And again, you want to add as much information as you can. So you can see here, we haven't actually been able to fill out all the information for this site, and that may well be common. For example, the date of abandonment, we don't have that exact information or the reason for abandonment. But again, the more information that you can add here, the better it is in terms of ultimately doing your risk assessment. So if we keep going over, we have things like, how do you access the site? What type of mine was it? What were the commodities? A description of the geology and mineralization, a description of the mining history, and then sources of information, so that somebody comes back to this later on, knows where this information was generated to put this information on the site. So that's general site information. Then we go to tab C, which are the mine site components. So now this is just understanding the mine itself. What are the different features that were at that mine that could be generating the hazard? So this isn't specifically the hazards itself. This is just understanding those components that exist in order for us to understand then the next step being the hazards. So you have a number of choices, and the way that the tool works is the area that's shaded here in light gray. That is where the user inputs information. The rest of the information here is provided in the tool. So on the left side in our first column here, these are the different mine components that could be present at a mine site. So as you're filling this out, your first thing would be, is this component present? And you have a drop-down menu that allows you to say yes, no, or uncertain. Sometimes it's not clear, especially if a field visit has not been done. So you identify if that component's present, and then you provide a description of that component. And then if you go over to the right, there is some guidance. So if you're like, well, what sort of information should I be providing? We have now provided some guidance here to help you with adding appropriate information that will allow you ultimately to do that risk assessment. So in this case, we saw from the photos, there's an open pit at the site. There are no underground workings, so we don't have that one. We've got some waste rock piles. They're relatively small, so we've put some dimension information, heights of about 2.5 meters, covering an area of about 100 meters square, and noting that the waste rock is stable, but it's within the town boundaries. A little bit of tailings again that we saw that photo of. Maybe I'll come down here to the process plant or the concentrator. So in that case, we had those cylindrical features there, 7 of those that were very steep, no fencing around it, definitely a safety risk there. There were remnants of buildings and that sort of thing, the crusher. So many pieces of that were still existing on this particular site. And I didn't show those photos, but there were some remnant office buildings and other features at that site. So some other infrastructure that we would want to be concerned about. And then we don't have any industrial waste. There were no comments on the overall site. So this is what we've been able to assess in terms of the components at the site. All right, so we've kind of now got a sense of what's there. The next one we go to now are the receptors. So remember, in the risk assessment, the receptor is about the consequence part. Who or what could be impacted by those hazards at the site? So this tab is about understanding now how people, livestock and wildlife, the surrounding environment, or properties and businesses could be impacted by the, well, actually, we're not talking, sorry, let me backtrack. We're not talking here about how they could be impacted. They have the potential to be impacted, so we want to understand how they're using the site. So, for example, with people, in order to understand the risks to people, we need to know are they using the site. So the way that this tab works is there's a series of questions for each of those different receptors. And then you can answer the question, so are people using the site? That's a pretty straightforward one to start with. The question is yes, no, possible, unknown, and not applicable. So there's a few choices there. And then you would describe that. And again, we provide guidance on the kind of information that you should put in describing that site. So in this case, are people using the site? Yes. It's within town boundaries. It's close to houses. There's fires in the bottom of the circular structures. And possibly there are some squatters at that site. We have a question, is surface water collected from the site? The answer to that was no. Is groundwater collected for consumption from wells or springs near the site? So we weren't sure about that. So our answer was possible. That's something would require more investigation to really get that answer. So we said no evidence, but it's close to town, so it's possible. Yeah, so we would go through these questions and answer as many as we could, or wherever there was a yes question to that. Then let's say we go here now to livestock and wildlife. Do livestock or wildlife use the site? So we said possible. There really wasn't evidence of livestock or wildlife using the site, but we expected that it is likely that they are probably using that site. Particularly, it's not fenced or anything, and it is adjacent to a town. Another question here, are there opportunities for livestock or wildlife to use the site? We say yes, it's close to town, open and unfenced. Then we talk about the surrounding environment. What is the surrounding environmental setting or ecosystem around the site? So we have a sense if it's a really unique or endangered ecosystem. There's questions about rivers, near that area. Do we see, are there any known impacts from the site on land, water, or plants? In that case, we said there's no vegetation over some parts of the site, which could possibly indicate chemical contamination. We weren't able to take samples here, but just by seeing areas with no vegetation that have been abandoned for many decades would really suggest that there may be some contamination preventing vegetation to take a hold. And then finally, we looked at properties and businesses. So, are there any properties or businesses located or operating on the site? It's in town boundary. We saw from one of the photographs earlier, there's a house really right adjacent to that site. There's a railway and the highway adjacent to the site. So there is, potential for those properties or businesses to be impacted. All right, so now we've understood these receptors by going through here and answering all these questions. Now we go, and this is really the crux of the, the tool now, is the hazards and rankings. So again, wherever it is grayed out, or there's some gray shading, that's where the user inputs information. And so the first thing we do is we want to understand the hazards at that site. And we have these different categories. So surface water contamination, these are the same sort of grouping of hazards that I talked about in the presentation. So surface water contamination, groundwater, dust and airborne particles, contaminated surface material, geotechnical instability, underground workings, buildings and infrastructure, and safety. So these are the different categories of hazards. And I will go over, we have to go over a ways here, but there is guidance material again provided on those hazards to help with identifying and describing them. So if I come back and let's just do surface water, we would say, is this hazard present? And you get a drop-down menu, yes, no, or possible. And then you need to describe that hazard. So in this case, we said there's waste rock and tailings may result in water contamination. However, plant growth may limit this. There's no evidence of staining or chemical accumulation on surface material or in potential drainage paths or in the open pit. And there's no use of surface water in the area. So, that's why we didn't say yes, there was surface water contamination. We just said it was possible based on the evidence that we could see at that site. Groundwater, so we're saying leaching of tailings and waste rock into groundwater could reach wells given the proximity to the town, but we don't know of any use of groundwater in that area. Now, just for the sake of time, I'm just going to skip through some of these, but again, we would added our information on the different parts of the site. And I want to go all the way down to this last one here, which is the open pit. So the open pit is not fenced, and this is, excuse me, not the open pit, this is for safety. So on safety issues, yes, there are safety issues. The open pit is not fenced and within town boundaries with potential for falls. There's the 7 cylindrical structures. They're not fenced or covered. They're easily accessible within town boundaries. There's potential for falls that could result in serious injury. And then there's old buildings that are unstable with sharp metal coming out of some of the process plant buildings. So there's a number of potential safety hazards at the site. All right, so then once each of those hazards are identified, this is now where we're doing our risk assessment. We're identifying the probabilities in column F, and then the consequences to the 4 receptors in the next column. So the consequences to people, livestock and wildlife, surrounding environment, and properties and businesses. Now, I've already filled out some of this, as you can see here. And I'm going to pop to the next tab and then come back just to see how this works. Once we have filled out the risk assessment, so the consequence and probability here, it is automatically transferred over to the next tab here. So it's automatically transferred into this part where we get a summary of all of the probability occurrences. And from there, we can transfer it over to our risk assessment matrix. So I want to come back to the hazards. What we haven't filled out here is the hazard for surface water contamination. All right, so give that a little bit of a thought. What is that probability of there being surface water contamination? And what we can do here is we have choices from A to E. So what's the probability? Okay, so we need some guidance on that. If you then go over to the probability guidance, which I'll click on here, this now provides guidance, and here's the surface water one, on how we might rank the probability of surface water contamination. So it gives us some sense, some wording, some guidance to help us to fill out that probability. So this is one specific for the tool. Then we also have one, I've used the ones from Queensland as well and put that in there. Likewise, when we're doing the consequences, we have some guidance on that as well. So we have guidance specific to the tool, and then I've also included the ones from Queensland, Australia as well. So you have a couple of different choices of things that you can look at to help you identify the probability or rankings. So what is the probability of surface water contamination? All right, so I'm going to go back to here, and I'm going to suggest it's possible. Surface water on site with runoff in most years, but minor visual evidence of contamination. Okay, maybe I'm pushing that because I said there was no visual evidence of contamination. So minor surface water on site with runoff possible every few years, but no visual evidence of previous contamination or impact. So probably B seems like the better choice. So I would choose B there. Now, what is the consequence of that to people? Well, given that the town is right there, there's buildings adjacent to the site, I would say that is probably a little bit higher than we, higher than we might expect, I suppose. So I'm actually going to choose 3. I'm going to go in the middle here, saying that while, and keeping these separate, the probability is not the same as the consequence. Consequence is only what happens if that risk, in this case, water contamination, occurs. So what's the common consequence to livestock or wildlife, given little usage on the site, but still potential? I'm going to say 2. To the surrounding environment, it is close to riverways, so we could, this is decisions that you would have to make, but I'm going to give it a 2 there. And the properties or business, again, they're really close to the area, but there is really limited water coming off of that site. So maybe I'll choose 3 here. I'll go a little bit higher. All right, and now then we would do the same thing for safety. Now, in terms of safety, I think there is really a probability of safety issues here. And that's the first thing, because there are those cylindrical features, there's the open pit, etc. So I'm going to go with the safety of D. And if I go all the way to D and look at safety, that would be moderately steep or high pit walls or rock piles, underground openings or workings accessible, large water pools or ponds deeper than 2 meters, evidence of regular airborne dust. So there's different safety issues, but it's the moderate to high pit walls that I think is the real issue. And where's the real safety to? Sorry for flipping around. Trying to get back up to the top. It's for people. So I'm going to say that for people, what would be the consequence? I'm going to say 4. Because if people fell off of those cylindrical objects, they would be seriously injured. To livestock and wildlife, which is the next one, I'm going to say 2 because you can get in and out of the pit and they're not likely to fall off of those features. To the surrounding environment, very little. Even failure in the open pit wouldn't go anywhere, so I'm going to say 1. And likewise to properties and businesses, I really don't think that there's a big issue there, so I'm also going to give a ranking of 1. All right, so then that takes me all the way over here. And the way that we fill this part out is we take then the highest probability and consequence ranking for each of the hazards, and that's what we transfer over to the risk matrix. So in this case, for surface water, we've got B3. So if I go all the way over to B3 right here, I would put in surface water, brackets, people. So the hazard is surface water, and the consequence is to people. And then the last one, which I haven't done, is here, which was the safety issue. So the highest is to people again. So the safety issue is actually D4. So up here, so safety, again, to people. So that is now my matrix filled out. And if I look at this and do an assessment overall of that, what I would say is most of the hazards at this site are relatively minor. They're in the green area. They're not something that would be of maybe huge significance, but by far the safety issues are the most important. So by doing that and identifying that, that really allows us to clearly identify the issue that needs to be addressed here. And if we have limited resources, which generally we do, then we can focus on those high-risk areas, address that through fencing, possibly filling those cylindrical features or removing them. And doing that alone will get rid of the major risks at that site. Secondarily in the yellow, we've got surface water because of some of the features. So that's another area that we may want to address. Finally, we have a tab here with site photographs. So we looked at most of these. So it's really important to put those photographs in there because of how important that visual aspect is. And then if I sweep all the way back to the site A here, or sorry, tab A, much of the information that we've done has now been filled out. And you can see that the summary matrix, here it is, showing the different risks or hazards that we've identified on the risk matrix. And as I said, it's the information from this tab that then can be extracted and put into an overall inventory. All right, I know that's kind of quick and dirty. My experience is, and having gone through this with people, that you only have to really do it once, and it's pretty easy to sort out. So I know I kind of stepped through that relatively quickly, but it is a fairly straightforward tool. And I'm going to stop my share now. The more information that you have, the better really it is to use that tool. So. All right, so there's our demo. Given our time, I want to keep moving on, and then we'll have some questions. We've been working, the IGF has been working with El Salvador on their abandoned mines program, and they've had a chance to use the tool and everything. And so I'm really pleased that we've got Myrna here who can provide a presentation about some of the work that they've been doing. So you can see how that tool has been used in action, I guess. So we've got Myrna Bonilla Argamedo, who's the General Director of Hydrocarbons and Mines in El Salvador, who is going to be speaking. And Myrna, we've got one more poll that we want to pop up just before you get going. So here it is here. So the question is, what type of mining has resulted in the most abandoned sites in your country? Quarries, exploration sites, small-scale mining, medium to large-scale metal mining, or coal mining? So let's just take a moment to see where that goes. So there we go. There's the results. Small-scale mining, so ASM mining, #1 in terms of impacts. Not surprising, with #2 being quarries, which is probably good because often quarries have less contamination issues, I'm going to say. Not always, but third is the medium to large scale mining. Fourth is exploration sites, and fifth is coal mining. So, all right, great. Thank you for doing that. Okay, so Myrna, you are able to share, hopefully, your presentation there.
So I'm going to switch to Spanish now. Buenos días a todos.
Good morning, everyone. I'm going to explain a little bit what was the mining sites in mining site management in El Salvador. This is some of the background in El Salvador. We have historical registry that there was metallic mining since the 20th century. The peak was between 1905 and 1917. And this happened without having any set framework or legal framework. So that increased the risk of exploitation without order. Then we had the first mining code in 1922. After the approval of this, production continued in 1950, there was a production level that Salvador was one of the main producers of gold and silver in the world. Then in 1996, we passed the Mining Act and its regulatory rules. And then in the year 2000, there was the provision of the submission of the last concession. And it was a little bit unorderly, and there were some liabilities. In 2015, we did a report that gathered all the information on this abandoned sites because there was not an orderly exploitation from the very beginning, and therefore some mines were abandoned. In 2017, the government, as a country, did not know how to do this remediation work, and therefore in 2017, metallic mining was forbidden. El Salvador is the only country in the world with this prohibition. In 2021, we created the Directorate of Mining and Oil Industry Energy. And then in 2024, we issued a report verifying the environmental conditions in all mining sites. In December 2024, we passed the Metallic General Mining Act, and now it came back to being possible to exploit metallic mining in El Salvador. And now in 2025, we did a field visit, and we did together with the IGF, and that's why we've taken on the task of working on remediation on the sites. This week, we did that visit. And therefore, we use the tool that Rob explained. The previous steps to assessment was an assessment of the historic information. There's a lot of historic information, so we analyzed it. We used to feed the tool. We assessed the old sites, considering that those 15 abandoned sites, there are only a few mines. Mine openings, and we did a previous diagnosis, and then we requested for approval so that we could have an action plan to be able to remediate these sites. What we did was more or less having a map of El Salvador. When this tool was executed, and we included all the information from the 15 sites, and we were able to identify that 5 of those 15 sites were priority to do something. You can see them in the map. They are on the west of the country, the east of the country, and some of these are very old sites with a lot of gold production. And then the last 4 ones are in Monjoro. We have the Monte Cristo mine. These are located in Monjoro. This is a very important mining site, or was a very important mining site. So we went to the field. We had Alejandro and Carlos Ortega come and visit us. We visited these 5 sites that we were able to identify as priorities using the tool, because the tool told us that it was those 5 sites that had to be included in phase 1. The visit took 2 days so that we could come to the abandoned mining sites. In the first one, we did a surveillance, and then we also identified this. Then there was a second visit in order to deepen the assessment and risk mitigation using the IGF experience. These are some of the pictures of the 5 sites. The main problem is tunnels and open pits. So in the historical literature, we were talking about water contamination. So we went there to identify water contamination, and where we had to do water testing, we identified those places so that we could later do the tests. Here you can see a chart here where we show the different aspects that were analyzed: the geothermic instability, underground water, surface water. And when we did this analysis, we saw some differences in comparison to the literature, because in some places there was no observations, no sightings of first-hand underground contamination. The literature spoke about 2 open pits, but we found only 1. And then in the second visit, we received recommendations on perimeter fencing, evening the surface. And something important to consider is that for all of them, we needed to do geothermic studies and detailed studies, including geochemistry, so that we could identify the watershed. Something to take into consideration is that now it is the dry season. So we would have to repeat this during the wet season so that we can identify better if there are any aspects. Now, regarding the results that we obtained with the tool is basically that we were able to standardize and systemize the data. We had things all over the place, and that allowed us to select better and have centralized information so that we could have more exacting analysis. At least that allowed us to have more history and understand the unique situation of each site. We were also take on an approach based on evidence. Thanks to this, we were able to identify that supplementary studies were required to readapt these places, to remediate those places. And we would have to start with some sites and then escalate to the other sites. We were also able to optimize and prioritize interventions. As I said before, we had 15 sites. As phase 1, we had the first 5 that I mentioned, and the tool also allowed us to have an integral coverage, comprehensive coverage. And the last thing I would like to say is thank you to the IGF team, Rob, Carlos, Alejandro, and Marina as well. They were very supportive in this. And we're still working on the final report because we have had the field visit only a few weeks ago, but we hope to be able to share our experiences with you. Thank you very much.
Yeah, great, Myrna. Thank you for that presentation and for stepping us through the process that you've used. Maybe a couple of points that I would make out of that is, the tool in its initial usage allowed for some prioritization. Now, in a way, you guys are fortunate because you don't have you have 15 abandoned sites, so it's a relatively manageable number. We did see at the beginning of the survey that some jurisdictions are talking about more than 5,000, definitely more than 100. That becomes sort of how do we even start? And so part of the aim of that tool as a desktop process is to do that initial prioritization so that you can identify sites that have high risk issues that then end up at the top of the list. Then, as you mentioned, going out and doing the field visit, while you can use the tool without a site visit, so much more information is gained when you do go out and actually see, as you noted, you identify features that maybe weren't so clear the first time around. And then you mentioned doing a second visit, for example, water and the potential for needing to take a water sample. If you go in the dry season, there's no water, then maybe you need to come back later when there is water. But by being able to focus on a smaller set of sites that do have potentially higher risks, that really help to focus your efforts, I guess. But emphasizing that field visit. Maybe I would say one more thing too, because I think this is ultimately what you'll be thinking about as you go forward, is, there's no one solution also to how to address abandoned sites. And I know that you're also looking at opportunities. There may be opportunities because of the historical nature of those operations. There may be opportunities for redevelopment of sites, and not just in El Salvador, but anywhere where people are doing that kind of work. And so while we might want to completely address all the issues at a site, we may not have the resources. And so we have to be selective. And that's where, again, a risk assessment is important. understand the high risk, address those ones. The others may be something that needs to be left for a period of time, or other approaches are developed. So anyway, thank you very much. I really appreciate that example. It's been great working with your team as well.
Thank you, Rob.
All right. So did you want to say any comments there, Myrna, before I move on?
No. Thank you. Yeah, I think what you said is very accurate. Also, it's very important that what you mentioned before about the financing. We as a government, we are doing all the financing pretty much by ourselves. So it's very important to prioritize which ones we need to address first.
Yeah.
And that's the amazing thing with your tool, that we're able to know which one we have to do it first. And that's what we're doing right now. Thank you.
Rob, do you want to go while they fill the survey through a couple of the questions that they had?
Sure. Yeah. And maybe first I can just address, I know there's been people asking about the tool. So it is not yet publicly available. So we do have a couple of little sort of tweaks to it. We want to make sure it gets translated properly and before we have that released. We also feel it's a tool that really requires some support. I mean, it is easy, but it's something that ideally we're working with our members to help them, effectively implement that tool. So we may have it sort of available on a request basis. We're still sort of discussing exactly how we're going to do that, but we will make sure to let everybody who signed up for this webinar, we'll update you in the coming weeks here once we have the tool finalized about availability of it. So just sort of stand by. I know we're kind of getting ahead of it, but we're wanting to get the anticipation going, I guess. So we will make it available shortly. So, and we'll let everybody know about that. So yeah, any questions? Happy if you've got some there in the chat, Marina.
Yeah, so there's one that says, what is the best practice to budget for the rehabilitation of abandoned mines? Should it be enshrined within the country's legislation?
I mean, I guess, in principle, I guess the idea of enshrining it in legislation is good, because then in principle, there would be a source of funding. I guess the question is, what is that source that would be enshrined in legislation? And that is often the challenge, is where are those funds coming from? If you were going to put something into your regulations about that, maybe it is a small levy on current operating mines that then can be used to address abandoned sites. That would be a good alternative. So, I mean, I like the idea of having a firm source of funding, but if you put it in legislation and then there's no source, then it doesn't really end up having much effect. So, me personally, I think that looking at ways in which the current operating mining industry within your jurisdiction can provide a small bit annually. You don't want to make it onerous on those operators, because it's in a sense not really their responsibility because it's for past operators. But I think that's kind of the best way of doing it. And if you can generate a little bit of funds on an annual basis, then you can apply those funds to address your high risk issues. That would be my suggestion, is looking at an innovative way of small bits of annual contributions from industry to address those sites.
Thanks, Rob. And then there was another one from Osoro Naftali from the National Environment Management Authority of Kenya, first saying that this is a very comprehensive tool that will assist a lot, especially artisanal abandoned mining sites. But also had a question saying, could it be possible that we increase the receptor/consequence beyond what has been provided by the tool? So this was while you were explaining the tool.
I mean, in principle, yes. If there are, those 4 receptors that we've identified, sort of people, livestock, wildlife, surrounding environment, businesses, and properties, generally, when you look at risk assessment initiatives around the world for mining, those tend to be the 4 categories, but they're not always exactly divided up like that. There are different approaches taken, and I think that in the case, let's say of Kenya, if there is a specific receptor that is quite important for the country or for a region, and could be impacted by abandoned mines, then I think the answer is yes. I will say that the questions, for example, the way we've got it set up in the tool is there's a series of questions for each of those receptors. They can also be modified. These are kind of general questions that would apply more or less everywhere, but if you're going to adopt the tool for your own jurisdiction, then for sure customizing it with the right questions, the right receptors for your jurisdiction would make sense. I think they'll probably still fall more or less in those 4 categories, because those are the ones that generally we are concerned about. But yeah, I mean, that's another reason with this tool why we like to sort of work with our individual members on it, is to make sure that it's adapted and works as best it can for that jurisdiction.
Good. Thanks, Rob. I think we have to leave it here because we're already 10 minutes past due. I did want to thank you a lot for this. This has been a thorough work, from consultations with countries to developing the tool to implementing it in 2 or 3 countries and then arriving to this moment. So this is very serious work. We're very grateful for this, and also wanted to thank Achim Constantin and Mirna Bonilla for being here, as well as the Namibia government for allowing you to present the case that you worked on. It is very important also for Namibia, Achim and Mirna, for us to share what other countries are doing. This is something that all of our members always ask. So this has been perfect. Thank you, all of you.